let me welcome you all as people are coming in. Today's event is hosted by Deacon's Global Digital Publics Network. I co-convene that network with David Marshall, one of our three speakers today. We have three stimulating talks from three scholars who are involved in exciting collaborations together, and David is going to say more about that collaboration when I pass over to him. Three speakers who are extraordinarily well placed to help guide us through the mediated world of COVID-19. With us today, Professors Andrew McStay and Vian Bakar, both of Bangor University in Wales. And also with us are two colleagues from the Global Digital Publics Network, Alexia Maddox and Luke Hemensbergen, both lecturers in communications at Deakin, who are going to act as moderators for today's discussion. So just a quick note on technology and logistics. We do want to make good use of the chat function for this discussion. We think that might ease help us do the best job of being able to talk to each other. So please do make sure that your mic is muted and let us know in the chat if you're having any kinds of problems hearing or seeing anything. And between the three of us involved in the moderation, we'll do what we can to help you. Please also feel free to use the chat quite fulsomely as the discussion unfolds with your responses, questions, or provocations as you're listening to the presentations. And our moderators will then gather up these points that you raise as part of the facilitation of the wider discussion. So the way we're going to proceed is we're basically going to allow each of the speakers to have their time, and then we'll pause and we'll deal with whatever discussion comes out of each of those talks. And then we'll have plenty of time for further discussion at the end. So any questions just before we get going? I'm just seeing a couple of things there. Does anything come up there, Luke or Alexia, that I need to be aware of? I'm just seeing a few strange things in the chat.
No, I'm just I'm asking people as they appear in the waiting room if they're interested or not, as a bit of a social barrier to, you know, get in or out. So thank you everyone who
terrific
made it through.
Well, let's get going. Let me introduce David Marshall, as I say, co-convener of the Global Digital Publics Network at Deakin and Professor of New Media Communication and Cultural Studies. David, as all of you know, has published very widely themes related to today's talk, especially on the themes of public personality, celebrity, and new media culture. Among his books are very aptly titled for today, The Celebrity Persona Pandemic, 2016, Companion to Celebrity, 2015, Celebrity and Power, 1997, Fame Games, Web Theory, New Media Cultures, and The Celebrity Culture Reader. David, let me pass to you to say whatever you would like to say by way of opening this discussion more broadly and then sharing with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Melinda. I'm going to try to share a screen so that will allow you to see a little bit more. I'm guessing I'm getting that there. And let me double check that I've done it. No, there we go. Does anyone see anything major as they're looking through at this? Can they see a screen off on their screen that relates to me and the overall theme of the seminar?
Yes,
Can you see
David.
that? Yep, good. All right, and we'll go into a little bit here. It's not major, but it's sort of to get a little bit of background around this to get everyone there. So this isn't my talk yet, but it's getting close to my talk. So as you heard Melinda speaking, and she's going to chair as we have there, and the people who are more or less the sponsors of this are, the first one is Global Digital Publics Network, and Melinda and I are the co-conveners of that, and a lot of people involved in this are connected to that at Deakin. And as well as that, the Alfred Deakin Institute at ADI is one of the co-hosts, along with the faculty, of the Global Digital Publics Network. So they're both also kind of sponsors of this. And I would say Bangor University, because this is where Andrew McStay and Vian Bekier are from as well. And an international network of researchers, which is called the Fame and Persona Research Consortium, is also one of the sponsors of these things. Now, where this comes from, what made us go forward in something dealing with something like a COVID pandemic, yes, you could pretend it was related to, you know, the title of my book from a couple of years ago or something else, because I keep using the term pandemic, but that isn't entirely it. Andrew Vian and I are trying to work on a project, and you can sort of see it there, Mediating Emotion in Network Culture, a study of the conversion of emotional communication. And we're trying to build that into a project that goes at one level, a starting sort of level, and then possibly going into a bigger international one. And Andrew and Vian are involved in all sorts of other projects that they can talk about later. So Melinda's talked about how things will run today. I'll just go through it a little bit more. We're looking at participant and engagement. Difficult sometimes when we tell you to mute, but if you use the expression that is now the new form of the presentation of the self, do something on your screen at different moments, we might see you. As Melinda also mentioned, we're going to have discussions right after each that are discussions. And Luke and Alexia are going to lead those, and that'll be clear as Melinda guides us through these things. So, and then there's a final summary at the end. So how do you participate? We're trying to use, and it may or may not be successful completely, but we're going to have our moderators look at the chat sort of thing, since we're all kind of muted, except me apparently. And in that, we're going to let you write a question, an idea there, and Alexia and Luke, depending on the session, because they're attached to each one differently, will come in there. There's Vian as well as Andrew up in the corner there, in my corner, but it might not be the same in yours. And maybe get them to wave for a moment just so we know who they are. So there they are. So keep yourself on mute, and then unmute to speak. But again, it will be after a moderator says, do you have something to add to the question that you might have asked or the discussion that you start? And then tech issues, use the chat as well. Luke, Alexia, Melinda, myself sometimes will also try to involve ourselves in trying to deal with that. But also, if it appears you can't speak, we'll read something there and sort of see that. So that's that one. So now we begin. The picture means nothing here. The other picture does. I took the original picture that's behind everything that I sort of sent around. This one is just, I want to say, and I don't want to say it in a big way, but I've sent it out to most people that we're going to record this and pass it on, because there's lots of people who, particularly in North America, that wanted to be at this, but it's a really awkward time. So it's not bad for Europe, it's not bad for Australia, not bad for a lot of Asia, but it's not good for North America in terms of time. So some of them are here and some of them are not here. So, and so if you want to just sort of put something there that you're okay with that, if there's anyone who wants nothing to be said related to it, go ahead and tell us. But generally we're mute, and but occasionally you might say some sort of things. But I hope that you're all aware that this is a kind of forum that we'd like to share with others. So now Melinda's already introduced who I am, so I'm going to go straight into my presentation. Is that okay, Melinda? I'll wait till you say yes. She's not saying yes. I will go straight into it. We'll carry on with that one. Okay, so the title of mine, and these are quick titles because this is meant to be a much more interactive sort of structure, is COVID-19 and the new emotionally inflected online personas. So I'm using some of my research that I've used before to get to that sort of level. But I'm just going to try to go to a screen that helps me read it. So occasionally I won't be looking at you. I'll probably look off this way. So don't take it in an offensive way. I'm very aware of, these kind of online identities get sort of thrown every time we do anything. So to begin with, online culture has already transformed our presentation of ourselves. And in my work, I've used the concept of persona to help elucidate this change. And I'm going to go through a basic definition because I can't guarantee everyone will have this. A basic definition of persona is that it is neither an individual nor collective, but the way an individual negotiates their path into collective spaces. So neither one nor other, but a negotiating strategy. With COVID-19, we're seeing variations of what I've called before a persona pandemic as billions present themselves online. The difference is the different patterns at which we are allowing emotion to be mediated, exchanged as a form of defining our different registers of persona: the personal, the public, the private, the intimate, and the professional. We sometimes forget that we are mediating ourselves through an intercommunication industry, one that is both highly mediated for different variations of sharing and exchange, and working at an incredibly interpersonal level and space with billions, as much as we are presenting quite different versions of ourselves for others. In other words, what we're doing is not ourselves, but it is a version of it. And this is what we're experiencing daily, hourly, maybe even, to use a great word right now, minutely. Means minute. Oh, should we do second? I won't do a big a joke. So let's go on to the next sort of slide to get us there. Just making sure I'm on my right screen here. So click on that. Now, the first sort of thing that I want to think about is this emotional expression that's occurring now. And I'm dividing it into kind of two orders. And I'll try to explain this. With COVID-19 pandemic, we can see a particular variation of an emotional expression and a communication expression pandemic. So emotional expression and communication pandemic. There are many reports of increased uses of social media, increased online forms of connection, greater numbers of Zoom meetings, looking at Instagram, watching the news, and again, news probably in quotation marks, because we're trying to express the difference of what that news might mean at this moment. Use has increased by some estimations by 40%. That's a lot, even though we've still got billions of people engaged in these sorts of things. But perhaps one of the biggest changes is the expanded demographic that is playing in the space. This mediated emotion pandemic that aligns with COVID-19 crisis is similar to the expansion of Facebook about 7 years ago as older people began using it. And so there's a new, wider engagement, very similar to what happened with social media, and then why certain youth groups actually abandon certain aspects of social media like Facebook at a particular time. But to understand the patterns of this new level and intensity of mediated emotion with a global health crisis and pandemic, it is useful to divide it into two forms of emotional transference. So this is the first order, is an affective level, affective, driven by statistics and charts, and I'll give you a little idea there, driven by exponential transformations in infections and deaths. This is, and I don't know if this is the same with everyone else, this is my everyday and my every night relation to COVID-19. I look at lists, I look at where I've lived on the planet, where I've visited, and it creates a certain anxiety in me. So whether it's when I've been in Wuhan many, many times, as our Wuhan guests know this, but also whether it is in Ireland or whether it's in Boston, where I used to live at one time, or whether it's part of Canada, or where it's my mother is, or where other relatives are. And I think about it all the time in terms of what it would feel like in those different environments, and how does that play even in what's happening in Australia at the same time. So the anxiety is there every day, and I'm far from alone. I think as billions are doing a variation of this, playing with aspects of news and basically, let me see if I can go back here a bit. Other variations, getting caught up in the numbers, getting caught up in all sorts of things that are there, getting caught up in watching people go into and out of some sort of testing environment, statistics, news, images that are all there, lining up for what are they doing? Graves, mass graves. What does that feel like? What would it feel like in Iran if we thought about what they are doing in constructing those sorts of things and knowing it somewhere in their presence? Or Bolsonaro, just today or a little bit before today, actually trying to do some sort of weird pickup truck protest about social isolation. So in those sorts of things, you can sort of see the strange sort of structures that are going on. And I'd call it a psycholinguistic or proto-linguistic emotional conversion. It's not there. We don't know what we're going to do, and we don't express this when we pass it on to other people. Sometimes we do, but usually this is just the fear and anxiety level, a first order. So where do we go from here in terms of these things? We go on to understanding it in terms of a translation. And in a way, it's affect labeling that's going on. And there are all sorts of affect label processes that are there. And I'll try to go through it quickly because I think I've used up my time. But affect labeling is not just a term that this Torah used in his article in 2018. It's been around for a while, but it's the way in which you attribute or situate something to handle it. So if a snake is about to bite you, it might be good to talk about that with someone else because that will attribute it in some other way. So we have that going on all the time. The first level is the ridiculous kind of level of emoji. Totally ridiculous, but industrially converted into an almost proto-linguistic, alphanumeric sign system that is driven by humor. And so we have all sorts of strange uses of emoji kind of lifestyle, not things that are kind of played out all over the place with emojis themselves, which gets us, in a sense, I'll just go back one here, gets us to an odd sort of thing that allows us to move from private to public. So whatever we've observed in that first order becomes the second order of converting it into something often humorous. Memes, another way in which we connect, move from the individual to the collective in this environment. And the one that we could go anywhere with this. We could go into TikTok, we could go into Instagram, we could go into Snapchat with all those things. But I thought I'd go into artistic works that have been played out. It was played out, shown in the New York Times recently, Instagram sort of structures of how people are reconstructing this relationship to artworks in different environments. And what you see happening here is not that they're the same, it's that they're converting it into their forms of self-isolation. And it is a pretty interesting sort of structure that's happening within this environment. So the third one is, I guess memes is in-group, mnemonics, songs. My Corona is the one that comes up in my mind. I don't know why. Other people have other pathways with which they use songs to express themselves. Staying Inside, I think, became another one. You know, these are 30 and 40-year-old songs that are reconfigured in different sorts of ways. Hashtags is another way to collectivize the experience. But they are, again, this second order affect labeling that's going on. And it's a level that may only occur for the next month or so. So I'm not going to go big into it, but it is a form in which we move into social media platforms, that we connect to others. We try to do these sorts of things by putting hashtags within whatever we are sharing and moving around. So on to the final thing, and it's always difficult to summarize these things, but what we see is a public self actually being transformed right now. On one level, you have something where there's a shifting emotional relationship to the political persona. And I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to allow other people to go further into it. I only put Bolsonaro up there, so I'm not going to go over that in a lot of ways. And it is super difficult to conclude here because we're watching it and feeling it at the same time we're trying to express it in an abstract, scholarly kind of structure. But what we're seeing is this emotional transference and signifying attribution producing a form of political instability. And it's interesting sort of thing to think that we're in an era of political instability. At the same time, we have an authoritarian relationship that's also going on, a governing structure that's going on at the same time. And the reason why I'm saying that public persona, political persona particularly, is in flux, is that we are deferring power in a certain way, but we're also taking power away, affective power in a sense, from celebrities. There are massive critiques of celebrities as they present themselves online. And that is a change in our representational culture into something else. And that defines a different kind of world that we're moving into. And that's where I want to conclude. We have this happiness as an outward expression of online persona when contained inside a dwelling, but fear of the other. We have something that I would call, with new affect labels emerging to kind of cover up, a proto stage of xenophobia. And this fear of the other is somehow sometimes hidden and sometimes played out in terms of relationships to other anger that emerges from this process of mediated emotion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for that, David. That's a lot to think about. And I'm just trying to put some probes out there. So if there's anyone who'd like to respond to David now, just use the, I think, do we have a raise the hand feature, or just pop it in the chat? I can see what we've got already in the chat window. Okay, so one thing that's come up is there's two parts of what you've been talking about, David, that have kind of got some conversation going. And the first part is this idea of the visualizations you were talking about and the affect around the curves on joint recovery and death and graphs versus this idea that these are about trying to foresee the future. So that's a conversation that Luke and Fan have brought forward. And then we've got Andrew and I'm sorry, E. Chapman, who've raised this question around your point on anxiety or fear as a, is it a basic emotion, and just the sense of not understanding your point about the fear of the other. So could you expand on that? So that's two pathways that have come in. David, do you want to take a crack at either of those?
I'll try. I mean, the fear of the other is once we're structuring our emotional containment in a sense, and what we can attribute to it is passing it to people that we've already somehow connected to, or they're connected by hashtags, other tactics and techniques of collectivization of what we feel is an emotional center of who we are. And through that, we are actually something that we haven't fully thought of in terms of online culture is, although it has been brought up in terms of echo bubbles and echo chambers, we also have that sense of reiterating, feeling the same thing being shared by others whenever we search for things. And it's not that produces a fear of the other, it's that our relationship to the everyday anxiety of what we do, leaving the house, going somewhere, not going somewhere, choosing not, telling part of our family it's not a good idea for you to do this thing, do that thing, don't bother going shopping today, don't do it for another 6 days. Older people actually having to pull away even further. All those things are playing out, that it's producing a kind of tactile environment that challenges our notions of what other is, what is external to the self, what is external to the collective self as well. And this is different. This is fundamentally different in some ways. It has connections. It has signifying chain connections to what is defined as an in-group and an out-group in the past, but it's a challenge to it, partly through the technology itself. That's how I would try to answer that, but I'd be happy to hear other ideas as well.
Great, thanks for that, David. So I think you're kind of getting a bit of response on that particular vein. We've got a comment from Janine, which was, does that mean her irritation with "we'll get through this, we always do"? repetition a sign of the authoritarian personality? Do you want to riff off that? Sorry, David, you're just on mute.
Unmute. I should unmute.
About my own personality there.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to be silent, you know, mainly because I think that's safer. No, I'm joking that I meant to unmute myself. There's aspects of our relationship to political leaders which we're just not reading accurately. We're reacting really badly in some ways. We're determining that we should, in the Australian context, be incredibly comfortable with notions of isolation and social distancing at a level that isn't the same in other parts of the world too. I mean, what we're hearing from the United States is the opposite. The idea of the challenge to social distancing is often in the news. We don't know if it's 2% of the population that's doing that, or 40% of the population that's doing that. But it's a challenge that is always kind of ever present in our negotiation of self-isolation, in our negotiation of the anxiety itself. So yes, power has increased in a sense at a moment where I would say that power was decreasing politically right across the planet. I've often also said that the populism that was emerging in the last 5 or 10 years, to me, was a kind of reactionary relationship to a change in the organization of global political culture. But here we're having something that actually shows an element of power that we have not seen for quite a while in a lot of countries. Again, I'll stop. These are ideas. They're not confirmed in any way, and that's part of what the workshop is about. How do we relate to this historically? How do we position what's occurring now in terms of a much more transhistorical relationship of humanity to relationships of power and relationships of doubt and relationships of crisis?
Thank you for that, David. You've got 2 more threads, and I think we'll make this the last set of threads for you right now. The first thread is coming through with Usha and, I'm sorry, I don't know the names, but Cilialam. Cilialam. Okay, so Usha has asked, Federer and Nadal had an 8-minute chat on Twitter about how they're going at this time. What is that? Are these 2 celebrities trying to make themselves relatable by expressing their own concerns? And then sort of a follow-up on that, is the performance of the ordinary that we recognize in celebrity culture now something that brings discomfort rather than positive emotional connections? So that's just like a first pathway, which you could take. And then there's a second set of comments that have come through, and that is, how do emotions play out at the global level, especially with memes that can be interpreted and understood differently? When we talk about the collective or collectivism, who is that we, and how do we delineate that we? So do you want to have a crack at either of those?
Alexi, I was a little lost on, once I got rid of my my shared screen. So my wife came in, Sally came in and helped me with that. Is a classic moment of personal and not so public and personal. Is I didn't quite hear the celebrity one, but I heard Nadal there. I knew that this must be related to my fascination with tennis in some sort of way. But in terms of, I think it's really important in the second one. You can come back to the first one. I'll try to answer the second one first. I think it's really important to understand every time we use we, the idea of we, how unstable it is. And the beauty of this session is it implies, this seminar, it challenges it in every possible way. We're dealing with maybe 15 people from 15 different countries here. We can't claim, as we do, that we have control of a relationship of space at all. We're dealing in a virtual kind of way. we might have that idea that we can say that we belong to one sort of area, but what is the we that we belong to? And I think whenever you're in a crisis, you pull back to what was possibly, I use the word animensis or whatever, the term that describes that we have almost a notion of what is our cultural existence that forms our current cultural existence. We start thinking about what's the core of our identity. That has great qualities to it, makes us probably sure of who we are. But on another level, it actually excludes other people, other cultures. And we have to be very careful about how we move through those spaces in a culture that has billions that are sharing things all the time. It's not the same as the plague, you know, centuries ago, where you'd say, halt, who goes there? We have a wall on our city, you cannot come in. And if you do, we'll, you know, pike you and kill you or whatever we might do. It is on one level similar to that, but not the same. And that is why this is critical for us to understand this new relationship to communication that's emerging and how it relates to something like COVID-19.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, David. Thanks, Alexia. I think this is a good moment to pause. We will continue to have all sorts of stimulating responses to your talk, and we'll note them for a little bit later on. Now I would like to turn and introduce Andrew McStay, who is Director of the Network for the Society of Media and Persuasive Communication at Bangor University in Wales, where Andrew also lectures on media privacy and digital culture. Among his most recent books are Emotional AI, The Rise of Empathic Media, Privacy and the Media, and again, very presciently for today's talk, The Mood of Information. Andrew's current work focuses most particularly on AI, emotional life and media. And David, Andrew, sorry, I'm looking at too many different names on my screen here. Andrew, we're really delighted to have you join us. So please come forth.
Unmuted. Thank you very much. Am I okay to share screen? Cool. Okay. Okay, bear with me. Okay, very good. So yes, so thank you everybody. Thank you everybody for coming, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. So what I want to do, I've got 5 minutes, so it's going to be, I'll be quick, but basically I want to talk a little bit of some of the background of empathy, talk a little bit about kind of relationship to COVID, and then some kind of issues that are potentially coming to us down the line. I think it's really useful to think about the context of empathy. So the notion of empathy, it comes from an older expression called fellow feeling. It comes from kind of British Enlightenment philosophers, but it's been picked up by American pragmatists and early phenomenologists. But the thing that I really like about this idea of empathy is its ontological dimension. So when we talk about ontology, basically all we're really talking about is about social experience. But this idea of kind of understanding the reality of others and where other people are coming from. And I think this book, the last book that I wrote, Emotional AI, The Rise of Empathic Media, I think that was kind of the driving point, was to think about what does it mean when technologies and applications of technologies and organizational uses are trying to work out where we're coming from. That's not to say they're successful, but I think it's a really interesting and pivotal moment where we have organizations and technologies employed to work out where we're coming from and what our affective states are, emotions, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that, you know, we're really at the start of something significant here. But I think, you know, to switch to COVID, I think one of the really interesting things about this has been about, you know, how we use this to manage ourselves, manage other people, manage children, manage parents, And I think David's point about the registers of persona is really interesting here, where at the moment I'm in slightly professional mode, although toned down a bit. After this, I'll be talking with my dad straight afterwards, and we'll have a very different register. But I think, you know, as we go through kind of the Zoom period and the COVID period, I think it's, again, David's point, I think is also really interesting in terms of, you know, as kind of these registers collapse, they're essentially kind of collapsed into singular portals. And I think, again, you know, MIT Tech Review kind of picked this up, this bizarre feeling of being socially overwhelmed through a portal, despite being physically far from others. I think this is fascinating. I think in terms of Zoom bombing, I really hope you haven't been on the receiving end of one of these, but I think what they show is the dark side of empathy. So empathy itself is, you know, it's a pretty value neutral expression. To work out where others are coming from isn't the same as sympathy. Sympathy is a very kind of pro-social idea. It's about wanting the best for somebody. Empathy is something that's quite different. It's about, certainly kind of applied to technology, it's about observation, it's about theorization, and it's about future action. And I think, you know, Zoom bombing has kind of really been about this. It's been about essentially trying to kind of understand the disposition of others and how they would react to a horrific situation. And yeah, it's the not funny side of all of this. In terms of COVID itself, you know, many are using sentiment analysis and social listening to try and work out kind of where nations and broader are at. We can debate the methods around this, possibly in some of the kind of conversation afterwards, but it's interesting that, you know, organizations are keenly trying to work out where countries are coming from. So the table that you've got in front of you is looking at the US and the UK and trying to track on a daily basis. Companies called Expert System, which is interesting for Anthony Giddens experts. But yeah, they're collecting kind of social media posts and every 24 hours updating semantic analysis of people's feelings during COVID. Again, we can debate methods afterwards, but I think what's important to recognize with this kind of data about sentiment is that it informs decision making. So it involves issues such as health decisions, policing, city administration, and so on and so forth. So it's important to see that when we're thinking about these technologies, we're thinking about kind of real-time feedback loops, and we're thinking about making sense of big data at speed. Okay. Oh, we got somebody's mic on there. But yeah, in terms of you know, what happens with this data, it informs all sorts of decisions. So macroeconomics is kind of a fairly decent place to start that in terms of not just kind of the physical impact of buying less stuff, but the impact on business confidence, again, implicates stock markets. So stock markets, yes, it's about data, yes, it's about production, but it's very much about emotion. So this idea of kind of mediated feeling is kind of permeating all sectors of society. But we can flip down to the micro. So in terms of kind of microeconomics and the behavior of individuals and small firms, again, we kind of saw this in terms of kind of the whole kind of loo roll debacle, with kind of people on WhatsApp kind of, yeah, kind of whipping up panic among their own kind of micro groups. In terms of data about emotion and sentiment, again, impacting on advertisers as well. So this is a slight kind of gear change away from sentiment to what's called facial coding, which is basically the use of cameras to register different facial movements on the face to try and work out an expression, and very arguably, very contestably, to work out what a person's emotion is. But certainly kind of market research firms haven't been slow to use the various technologies that they can to gauge civic emotion within given regions. So this is a company called Realize, who's a bit of a market leader within emotional analytics, and they've got people opted in to share their webcams to gauge facial reactions. But interestingly, there's a passive dimension. So whereas facial coding in the Realize case is about a situation that somebody has opted into, we also have kind of more passive modes of tracking. So what you're looking at the moment is a press release And WPP is one of the largest advertising conglomerates in the world. They work with Spotify. And again, they're kind of registering music choices in terms of tempo, in terms of energy, as a means of predicting mood and thereafter kind of impacting on advertising decisions. The press release here is from 2016. The deal is still ongoing, but I'd be really interested to know what's happening with Spotify data at the moment. Of course, you know, this isn't just about business. This is about politics too. Vianne, who will be coming after me, will be talking more about kind of political feedback and political sentiment. So I don't want to kind of stray too much into her talk. But I think suffice to say that the mediation of emotion through data in terms of sentiment and so on is impacting on civic decision making and public administration. So in essence, kind of what we're seeing throughout all of this is the modulation of emotion. And I think, although I'm kind of rushing through this, I think it's just worth lingering on that point. That the use of data about affect, about mood, about emotion, about feeling, and so on and so forth is being modulated through feedback loops throughout society in relation to how we kind of deal with each other in terms of parents, in terms of children, in terms of an organizational level, in terms of how it involves stock levels within shops, in terms of civic decision making, and kind of so on and so forth. So again, it has a very dynamic nature, and I think that's kind of one of the really kind of key changes with empathic technologies is this dynamic, this kind of real-time capacity. So I'm running out of time now, but I just want to kind of point to a few things on the horizon line. What you're looking at present is a patent by Amazon. And if you have a look at through some of the conversation between the speaker and the person, you'll notice Alexa kind of registering that the person is coughing and sniffling. You're noticing kind of marketing recommendations for chicken soup. I don't know if chicken soup and COVID, if that's a recipe, I'm guessing that's not a thing. But I think this interplay between kind of physical health and analytics is a really, really interesting one. And what's important to note is that the same analytics that are used to detect the kind of highs and lows of a person speaking, for whether they may be ill or not, or whether that deviates from usual patterns, is also the same analytics that are employed to register emotion. And Amazon, you know, they've been looking to release a stable product for some time. I think it's a matter of months rather than longer until Amazon releases a stable emotion-centered product for the home. And of course, you can scale that up to your own mobile phones and so on and so forth. So in terms of what we have, in terms of the situation where we're in, there's Nicholas Rose captured this in relation to a discussion of biopolitics some time ago. But, you know, about this idea of kind of reshaping, engineering and modulating the vital capacity of human beings. And I think, you know, extrapolating from that, I think when we think about empathic media and we think about what empathic technologies are, what we're talking about is nothing less than the automation of consumer and industrial psychology. You know, there are clear negatives there, but, you know, but I think there are scope for positives as well. And maybe we can get into that in some of the discussion afterwards. So to end then, we've come a long way since the early discussion of fellow feeling, empathy as a basis for moral life, American pragmatism, and phenomenology's interest in the social experience of being within and Husserlian ideas of co-presence. But in relation to COVID, I think it's really shown some of kind of empathy's ontological dimension. I think this is something, you know, technology aside, has become kind of a real, yeah, we are empathizing a lot more, and in many ways in a very kind of pro-social way. But certainly in relation to technology, some of the uses are active, we've opted in, but there's a lot of passive profiling going on. I think socially and critically, this needs some investigating. But in terms of this passive dimension, again, I come back to this idea of kind of modulation and modulating the disposition of others, which is about management and to an extent control, which certainly kind of has, I don't mean to go dystopian there, but there are implications there. These technologies will scale, I think, as long as there's any personal, economic or organizational value in emotion, these technologies are going to scale. Lots more that I wanted to say, lots more to get into, but I better stop there. Thank you very much.
Excuse me. Thank you very much indeed. Very insightful stuff, and I'll try my best to synthesize what's coming through on the chat. Pat Kang Wong and I actually had a very similar train of thought, so I'll just read his verbatim as he is better than I at the words today. How will the political power shift with these type of quantification of emotions vis-a-vis the pandemic? Will citizens be required to more carefully curate their online emotional expressions because of the implication to policy? And does it mean that the space of their own emotional interpretation will be more and more constrained and thus increase some sorts of emotional inequality? And this emotional inequality, I mean, really speaks to that, what you're speaking about in terms of control and a layers of stratification that you would assume increase if there is real-time emotional analysis that's going on. Can you maybe speak to those questions?
Can you just repeat the second point, the point about emotional inequality?
Sure. So as I interpret it, are there some sorts of emotional inequality that emerge if and Pac, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but emotional inequality that emerges if some people have the analysis of emotions in front of them and others don't, and if other people are constraining their emotions through the registers we have, you know, the affordances of these digital technologies pick up or don't, and does that lead to power dimensions that are emotionally inequalitative and filled with power relations?
Okay, I'll have a go at those. So I think the point about kind of self-control and about self-management in relation to behavior, I guess the problem there is that by not engaging with sentiment and other modalities of kind of emotion capture, I guess that behavior is significant in and of itself. So for example, if a kind of a person is kind of reticent to engage, if they kind of have kind of high level blocks, or even indeed if they're kind of actively taking measures not to display facial emotions or whatever it might be on a video call, for example, I think that's telling in and of itself. So in terms of the practicalities of kind of clustering that behavior and then that behavior then feeding into a decision, be that an advertiser decision, a market decision, or thereafter, that act of denial, the act of being unwilling to share emotion says something. And it says something behaviorally, affectively, and perhaps emotively as well. In terms of the emotional inequality point, I'm still not quite sure I've got that, but I think in terms of I'll have a go, but I think in terms of the nature of the technologies themselves, they're highly, highly simplistic. So even within kind of a Western context where many of these technologies are certainly being rolled out by the larger companies, Amazon, Google, Facebook, etc., they have a very limited register of what of kind of emotion types. These are hugely debated. Some people on the call will be very familiar with kind of Ekman and Lisa Feldman Barrett and some of the problems with these articulations of emotional life. So in essence, what you have kind of particular psychological models which are being employed. Many psychologists and many kind of social theorists just don't buy this at all. They prefer a social constructionist approach to emotions. The problem is for technology companies, that's much harder to implement. So in essence, what we have is we have kind of a global articulation of emotional life based on very shaky foundations. I think if I can, again, in terms of the power, if I can understand that in relation to kind of region and country, I know this is one of Pac's interests as well. I think certainly seeing what we're seeing in relation to some of the Japan work that we're doing is that local companies are very aware of this and are building smaller data sets, because in terms of the analytics required to actually run kind of sentiment analysis, facial coding, voice analytics, and so forth, it doesn't actually require huge data. Small data will do the job. So you're seeing kind of smaller regional companies, very mindful of kind of the global hegemony of kind of larger tech companies, but actually using that to their strategic advantage.
Thanks. Andrew, I was quite interested what you said about the limits of the registers on the technical side. And E. Chapman has come back and said, can we emphasize that actually probably those limits exist on our side, the human side as well. We can't read body language in Zoom, for instance. He has the example of counselors used to working 6 meetings a day, finding that they can only do 3 meetings a day over Zoom. Do you see the limits being pushed in that direction to the human side, as opposed to the theory or the actual tech side? And do we have any information that we can think about expanding the ways we can measure, or I guess control for those human sides?
Yes, I think it's a really useful observation. So it's very easy to lapse into the idea that technologies, no, of course they can't register affect and emotion, and whereas kind of people have some intuitive, some kind of sixth sense where we can kind of gauge the dispositions of others. And that's just not how people work. People do make mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. Every time kind of I see a student, I don't, be a little bit careful here. Yeah, but I think basically, yeah, we do make mistakes in terms of how we read the dispositions of others, and perhaps not having kind of complete understanding of the context in which a person draws upon to kind of emote and to behave and express. So I think in terms of kind of the technologies themselves, I think there are improvements taking place. I'm not trying to defend them here, but there's certainly kind of a keen awareness in the industry of the need for more contextual data. So whereas a lot of the criticism has been about, well, a facial arrangement, how can that kind of belie an emotional state? And certainly the kind of recent technologies, and I think even going back to the origins of consumer psychology, where, kind of playing with kind of basic affective measures, there was an understanding that that one is required to triangulate the different data points if, to kind of reach some level of accuracy. So, yes, I think, but certainly kind of the point about, kind of human failures is taken.
Sure. And Janine Little asks, sorry, I'm just scrolling up again. Is it all empathy then, or is it Isat's empathy? Is it that is this what you mean by passive? The virus threatens everyone equally, but before this, the experience of empathy, in her opinion, was conditional.
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Janine, do you want to give that a go for any clarifications?
Was that what about faux empathy, and as in kind of false empathy?
I think so, yes.
Right, okay. So this is kind of a more kind of a basic human point in terms of how we relate and interact with others. I don't know is the short answer. So in terms of kind of how we kind of interact with kind of others on calls and through our various devices, I can't speak to kind of the kind of human point of whether this is kind of faux empathy, but certainly I think at kind of a core kind of affective level in terms of kind of my experience and those around me, and there does seem to be kind of a real kind of qualitative gear change in terms of how we interact with others. In terms of kind of mediation of empathy, is it a faux empathy? Again, it really kind of depends on whether you kind of think of empathy as a pro-social thing in terms of whether it's kind of something that's connected to sympathy, but certainly kind of how I use the expression empathy, it's more about interpretation, it's more about theorization. So it's about sensing, observation, and kind of contextualizing those insights into what is already known. So that's what's called it's more of a kind of a theory-based approach to empathy. It's a bit colder.
Okay, I'm hearing Luke, or seeing Luke press the mute button. So perhaps we'll hold our thoughts there. Andrew, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about and to come back to again shortly after we hear from Vianne. So Vianne back here is Professor of Journalism and Political Communication, also at Bangor University in Wales. Deanne's main areas of interest focus upon media agenda building struggles, issues of trust, accuracy and credibility in journalism, the security state and public accountability. And among her publications are a 2018 book, Intelligence, Elites and Public Accountability, Relationships of Influence with Civil Society. That's with Routledge. 2013, Torture, Intelligence and Surveillance in the War on Terror, Agenda Building Struggles. And also an edited book, Communication in the Age of Suspicion, Trust and the Media. And Deanne, I know you have a much longer CV that I've only just dipped into, but welcome. We're delighted to have you with us, and please, off you go.
Thank you very much for that delightful introduction. Yeah, none of my books actually reflect my interest in what I'm going to talk about today. But I have also been doing a bit of writing with Andy on empathic media and sort of, well, various angles on that. So, I mean, today what I want to do is really think about the challenge posed to governments in terms of how they're trying to manage public emotions and also the associated behaviour around COVID-19. And because what governments are trying to do is to get us to comply with what is absolutely massive structural and social change. So I'm going to cover very briefly the idea of risk issues, behaviour change, and also what happens when the emotional tone is misjudged. So in terms of risk issues, I mean, any of you familiar with Ulrich Beck and his seminal book, The Risk Society, will recognise that COVID-19 is a risk issue. I mean, obviously it's inducing systematic and irreversible.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I've accidentally clicked off your screen share, so we can see you give the presentation, which looks lovely, but if you'd like us to go through slides you will have to reshare your screen.
Okay, I'm going to have to work out how to do that, and I don't know how to do that. I'm on Andy's computer. So the mediation of technology is one of my recurring nightmares, in fact. No, is it shared though? It's not shared.
All right.
How does one share on this computer? We'll get there. Aha, here we go. Multiple screens really faze me, especially when...
You have to do a double, there you're on.
How are we going?
Nearly there.
Nearly there. How's that?
You're on now, that's great.
Rightio, let's... Right, risk issues then. So COVID-19 is a risk issue, right? It induces systematic and often very irreversible harm, death, especially for the old and those with underlying health problems. The risk remains invisible, it's inaccessible to the senses, it's very immaterial until the point that it actually materializes as symptoms. It's based on a causal interpretation. You know, we are very reliant on the experts to tell us what is happening here, how it's spreading, epidemiologists, behavior change scientists, and all of these other people who are trying to model different interventions about what to happen in order to limit the spread of this disease. People have to operate in COVID-19 without an adequate foundation of knowledge. We just don't know so much about this disease, basically, you know, and not least that there's no vaccine or cure, which makes it very frightening, but a very incomplete understanding about how it's spread, how infectious it is, whether you can build up immunity, who exactly is at risk. And this knowledge has been changing week by week, I think, over the last few months. And as Beck would say, this leads us to a society which is very much uninsured. You know, it's incapable of actually providing for the uncertainties that it faces. And these are all features of the risk society that Beck talked about several decades ago, but COVID-19 hits all of those notes for me. And this poses really big challenges for governments actually trying to manage the population. And, you know, the invisibility, the immateriality of the risks, it makes the representation of risk ever more important in terms of how we socially construct it. But of course, the lack of adequate knowledge that we have here about the risk and the dependence on causal interpretations, it does mean that COVID-19 and how we respond to it governmentally can be challenged on very many levels. Everything from the appropriateness and the robustness of the data to the models, the assumptions that they're based on, the value judgments that are used to interpret very incomplete evidence. And for Beck, you know, this means that the risk is a peculiar thing. It has a peculiar political explosiveness, in a sense. You know, what was once considered apolitical becomes political. Suddenly, you know, government is extending right into the very personal and private sphere of our lives, of how we live, of how we communicate, of how we be, how we exist, how we shop, how close can we be to somebody physically. You know, these are all political decisions now. And Beck says, you know, when this happens, suddenly when everything turns into a hazard, somehow nothing is dangerous anymore. That's one of the possible ways that can go. Because when there's no escape, maybe people ultimately just don't want to think about it. That is one possible direction. And he says this allows the public mood and also the private mood and the political moods to swing wildly in any direction. The risk society for Beck can shift from hysteria to indifference and vice versa. So I think this risk angle is a huge challenge for governments trying to manage COVID-19, because we have basically a very inadequate foundation of knowledge, right? A very high potential for social mood swings. And in the midst of this, governments are instructing their citizens to engage in profound and rapid behaviour change, cutting physical contact, not going to work or working from home, with no end in sight for many countries, UK being one of them. So, you know, the government, therefore, are massively studying the population to work out what society will bear and also how to nudge people into the desired behaviour that they want them to engage in. So very brief, if you haven't heard of this word, nudging, there's a nice literature there from behavioural economics and cognitive psychology. The quote there from Thaler and Sunstein's book, Nudge, very influential book in government circles. So a nudge is basically any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behaviours in predictable ways. That's their definition. It mustn't forbid their options. It must only significantly change their economic incentives. So to count as a nudge, any intervention has to be easy and cheap to avoid. So that's Thaler and Sunstein. Moles et al. From Australia have generated a better definition, I think. They reserve the term nudge for interventions that actually tap into psychological human failings and that lead people to fall back on automatic rather than systematic information processing strategies and decision making. So, you know, basically tapping into people's propensity to choose options that demand the least effort. That's a nudge. Or, you know, tapping into people's propensities to conform to prevailing group norms. In other words, nudges bypass rational thought processes in favour of your more intuitive ones, your gut feelings, if you like. So the British government, which I will talk about, has a nudge unit. It has had this for a decade, and it works all over the world, actually, to try and apply its efforts to specific policy challenges around the world. This is the Behavioural Insights team you'll see on the slide. But it has been looking into COVID-19 and how to nudge people in the right direction for COVID-19, for instance, to improve public recall on the health guidelines in COVID-19. They did 20,000 trials, I think, or trials amongst 20,000 British adults last month to see how people were recalling public health guidelines. And they found that young men in particular were very bad at recalling even the guidance that the government has on COVID-19, and also that they were least likely to follow recommended practices, you know, hand washing, social distancing, self-isolation, that sort of stuff. So the Behavioural Insights team, the nudge unit, they have recommended that the government devise special strategies to increase compliance amongst young men. And they haven't actually on their website said what these strategies should be, but they do point by way of example to the video appeals on Twitter that appeared at the end of March in Britain from the Premier League footballers to follow government guidance. And if you click on the Twitter thing, 28th of March from the Premier League, you'll see loads of different famous footballers in a little video just saying, and you know, you need to wash your hands and you need to do this and you need to do that. So this is meant to be a nudge intervention, to just nudge that demographic into doing the right stuff. And really, you know, these behaviour change experts are very much at the heart of the government's Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, or SAGE, lovely acronym, co-chairs on the screen. So this group is tasked with providing the government with advice, which aims to anticipate and help people to adhere to all the interventions that government are recommending. It's issued lots of reports across the last month or so. That's just some of them from the SPIB group, which is the Independent Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviour. So this is the behaviour change group. And this is all available on the government website. You can look at it. They're all concerned with how people are likely to react to government interventions in this changing, you know, scenario of what to do about COVID-19. Just to highlight one or two of them, this is their report from the 4th of March. It concluded, for instance, on the likely impact of school closures. So schools hadn't closed in the UK at this point. They were saying, well, what would happen if we close the schools? How will people react? And the report notes the growing discontent with such a policy in Japan, of all places, because obviously they're drawing data where they can from around the world. They also talk about what measures are likely to be socially acceptable. And at that point, they thought isolation would be socially acceptable, also social distancing, and preventing mass gatherings. So that's quite interesting that the government did then go down that route a few weeks later. The report from the 14th of March, 10 days later, makes some interesting points on public disorder in Britain. And it agreed, thankfully, that large-scale rioting is unlikely. So that was their recommendation on that. They thought that people would be engaging in acts of altruism, largely, and that the government should try and encourage this. Above all, though, they said, look, if the government wants to limit public disorder, then it needs to provide clear and transparent reasons for the different strategies that might be taken. It needs to set clear expectations on how the national response would develop, and it needs to promote collective action throughout the country. So that's what they said the government needs to do. It's a couple of weeks ago now, well, a month ago, in fact. So the question remains then, you know, how do governments manage the emotions of its public? How do they get people to comply with government measures whilst maintaining public trust in a risk issue that's full of uncertainty when everyone's in lockdown and most of the communication is happening online? How does government get around this multiple layer upon layer of problems? I mean, when Beck formulated his risk society thesis in the 80s, and he noticed these public mood swings on risk issues, this was pre-social media, obviously. We're now in the social media universe. We know that social media is an emotionalized environment. Plenty of research on that shows that to be the case. Emotion drives social engagement. Facebook knows this. Fake news purveyors know this. Politicians know this. Some brilliant examples of social media and the display of emotion online at the moment. There's a couple of examples there that I like. But of course, news is an emotionalized sphere as well. News organizations want just the right amount of emotion, enough to generate engagement, but not so much that you're disbelieved. It depends what channel you are, of course, or what news outlet. Some news outlets are extremely emotional. Fox News is on the screen there. And that famously said, you know, coronavirus was hysterical. It wasn't a real thing. It was just flu, very irresponsibly. Of course, you know, we have the problem of misinformation as well with COVID-19. This is an example of very emotive misinformation about Germany sending China a massive bill for coronavirus damages, and this sparking fury in Beijing. I mean, this was really not true. It was the opinion of someone in one of the German magazines. It wasn't Germany's opinion, it was a German magazine's opinion. And of course, disinformation is rife as well online. So much so that the British government set up Infotagen to try and fact check all the stuff going on with fake news on COVID-19. So it's a difficult environment, right, to manage, I guess is what I'm saying here. There's layers upon layers of difficulty. And, you know, what happens when the government gets it wrong? In all its, you know, careful behaviour change research and prompts. I mean, it's all very well trying to gauge public feeling to nudge people. But what if the key messengers, and really in this point, I think government is a key messenger, what if they get it wrong? What if they encourage the wrong sort of behaviour, for instance? I mean, remember, risk issues are riddled with uncertainty, as is COVID-19. I mean, here's Boris Johnson getting it famously wrong in Britain. So on the 3rd of March, just over a month ago, Boris Johnson made a really big deal about going into a hospital where there were some coronavirus cases and shaking people's hands in that hospital. I mean, for me, talking about public persona management, this is very reminiscent of a move that Princess Diana in the UK did in the early 1990s, to go to hospitals and to actually physically touch AIDS victims in order to destigmatize them. You know, and this was seen as a brilliant thing that she did to change public perception about AIDS. I mean, it seemed to me that Boris Johnson was tapping into that sort of historical memory in Britain. But God, had that backfired, you know. I mean, just a few weeks later, he had to institute social distancing measures. And then, of course, he got seriously ill. He came down with COVID-19 and he was in intensive care, you know, which is massively problematic for maintaining the morale of the British nation. So he got it really wrong. And, you know, then what happens in terms of what people remember? What messages are they remembering? Probably the first one that he did, that, you know, it's okay to go out there and be physical with people, because that's basic psychology for many. So you can get it wrong in that way. And also, and this is my last slide, you can also get it wrong by just lacking empathy. I mean, Priti Patel, Home Secretary, very badly lacked empathy in there's a daily press release briefing in Downing Street. And in Britain for the last few weeks, there's been a massive furore about the lack of personal protective equipment for doctors and frontline workers in hospitals. And she went on the briefing basically saying, look, I'm sorry if you feel that there have been failings in personal protective equipment. And this really did not go down well, because there are failings. It's not that we feel that there are failings, there are failings. Obviously, she's trying to avoid responsibility from the government for this lack of the National Health Service having this equipment. And of course, if you get it wrong, if you get your emotional register wrong, social media will take the piss. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And one of the memes up there, one of the more popular memes, when I looked, 24.4K, was, you know, this one from Star Wars. I'm sorry you feel we've blown up your home planet of Alderaan. But there are many, many other memes out there of the internet reacting very badly to Priti Patel. Doesn't do her any good. And it doesn't help the government either in trying to manage public feeling. So basically, as I conclude, I say managing public emotions for COVID-19 is really difficult because it's two problems. It's a risk communication problem, which has its own inherent problems, and it's a behavior change problem, you know, where you're trying to change the architecture of people's choices and get them to buy into it. So I guess what I'm interested in, because we have such an international team here on the call, is how has this manifested in different countries? You know, is the risk of COVID-19 perceived differently in other countries? Are the behavior change problems similar or different? And what is the role of mediated emotions in managing COVID-19 in your country, wherever you are? So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. We've got a couple of sort of threads that are coming out of the chat window for you. So what I'd just like to do is start perhaps with the first set of threads. And I guess this was brought together by some Australians. So we were responding in listening to you at the moment when in your discussion around nudging. And the government here has introduced this sense of trade-off for Australians, where they're saying, we'd like to introduce a tracking app. And if you all voluntarily take up the tracking app, then you can come out of isolation. So there's that sort of point that people were discussing. And I guess then it folds into the second point that was raised, and this one went in a few different directions, but it's Andrew Prowl asks, do you find it interesting that in this time of invisible or intangible and invisible risk, many governments are attempting to comfort people with intangible rewards? So for Andrew, that he moves on to the discussion of how digital currencies are being put forward as ways to create stimulus payments and obviously comfort people. And so there's a whole thread of discussion around that. But I actually do see that those two threads probably are actually talking to perhaps the same thing. Would you have a response for that, or would you like me to unpack them a bit more separately?
Ooh, well, I'm not sure what's being asked there. I mean, I think, you know, across the world, governments are doing their best to tap into their population, and they will have done the research on what that population will bear and what, you know, what might work, what might not. Tracking apps, getting people out of isolation. Yeah, I mean, I think Britain is also thinking about doing something similar, isn't it, Andy, with NHS X? Although I'm not sure if it will be used to bring people out of isolation.
I don't think it'll be the NHS app.
No, probably not, no. And intangible rewards, digital currencies. I haven't heard of that one. That's interesting. I mean,
okay, yeah. Would you like Andrew to speak to that a little bit, or do you want to riff off it?
Well, possibly, but I mean, in terms of the intangible rewards, I don't know if yeah, I just don't know about that. But so maybe get him to speak on that. But I mean, from a British perspective, I mean, the intangible rewards seem to be a lot more emotional, actually. Like, for instance, we've had the clap for carers stuff, where once a week, every Thursday at 8 p.m, everyone goes outside their house and applauses or cheers for the National Health Service workers. And that's been a very intangible reward for me, going out when I never would normally go out anyway, and listening to my village. I live in the mountains. My village is shouting at the top of its voice and banging kettles and pans and saucepans, and that is lifting everyone's mood. And it makes you feel like you are actually engaging and doing something to, you know, just by staying at home. And that's the very purpose of that. You know, it is a morale booster, and to make you personally feel like you're invested in this, you know, helping knock COVID-19 on the head. Digital currencies, I don't know. I mean, I think the other side of the intangibility is actually the tangibility. I mean, whether people are able physically to stay at home because of the economic underpinnings. Are they able not to go to work? Do their employers allow that? Can people just give up their jobs? Is there a employment furlough scheme so that people will be paid regardless of going to work? You know, the British government is doing all of these things slowly. I think those tangible rewards are actually much more important than maybe some of the intangible ones, although that's just my own personal perspective. What is going on with digital currencies, though, as an intangible reward? I'm quite interested to know about that.
I can talk a little bit about that. So in the United States, one of the first drafts of their big stimulus bill, which everyone was talking about, you know, multi-trillion dollars, probably the biggest financial news in there, I used to work on Wall Street, so, you know, I follow the bloggers, was that they thought about distributing it with a digital dollar, which is talked about which has been talked about for a long time. It's essentially Bitcoin. It allows governments to distribute money without actually printing it. You don't get a physical check. It just appears. And China is doing the same thing. They're piloting a digital currency now. And a lot of governments are talking about doing this versus, and I contrast that to tangible rewards, like Vietnam, for example, no stimulus check. Instead, they started stockpiling rice. They want to make sure that there's food in the markets. Here in Singapore, they handed everybody a mask. Here's your mask. This will mitigate the risk. Whereas elsewhere in the world, we say, well, we're just going to make some money appear in your account, right? So that's how I think of tangible and intangible rewards. And I wonder if there's intangible risk, you know, what's the calculus there? I find it interesting. So that's all.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. Do you have anything to say on that, Andy?
Not really.
No, right. Yeah, we don't know is the answer. Interesting point, though.
Neither do I know. That's the point.
No.
Andrew, do you see this then? I mean, because it sounds quite a risky strategy. So are you saying that this is kind of a blockchain-based currency that's being disseminated to populations to help them cope with kind of the economic crisis? Because that seems to be pushing towards decentralization. That sounds quite dangerous for governments.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I wish I was an economic scholar and I understood it better. But there was a lot of discussion about how all of a sudden you are decoupling your currency from a physical. The central bank is not printing it, and that now causes people, the value of money, it loses value when everybody is just getting money and they've got nothing better to do than stand in the grocery market and buy toilet paper, right? All of a sudden everybody's got $2,000 and what are they going to do with it? Whereas in the past, you used to have this physical, I was in the United States in 2008 financial crisis, and we got checks. We had to go, we had to cash those checks, and we had money, and it felt like cashing your paycheck. I had earned this or something, and it makes you more careful than when it just kind of comes out of nowhere. And actually, someone else in the chat posted in an interesting example of where in some of Thaler and Sunstein's studies, they substituted an emotion with money, physical with money, and talked about how their behavior changed. You could probably read the chat. They can explain it better than me. But I just thought this was interesting, and I just wanted your intuition on this. That's all.
Thank you for that. What I'll do is to move on to the second strand of questions or discussion that's really coming through. But I might actually invite Jen to speak to his post, and then that might help to more accurately unfurl that conversation. So Jen, do you want to speak to your point?
Hi, Alexa, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, my point is that I think the Chinese government has done quite well to manage this global risk. And my focus is about the government's emotional work through its social media representations. I think on the one hand, the government senses the social media posts that convey negative and critical emotions to eliminate the negative effects of the negative feelings from the public, and on the other hand, it proactively uses social media to tell successful and uplifting stories to promote the positive energies. That's what I observed on Chinese social media platforms.
Right, yeah. Well, China is well versed, is it not, in managing public moods, I would say. This is my impression as an outsider, and I've never been to China, but this is the impression I get is China actually has a lot of practice in this, not in a COVID-19 sense, but just generally.
Right, yeah.
So it's quite well set up, I would say, as an outsider to do this. I'm not sure that, other governments, such as the British one, is that used to doing this. I don't know what your sense is on that, Andy, but I don't think some governments are necessarily into this, really. This might be the first time even for governments such as Britain, where they're actively trying to, national emergency legislation. We have to manage the public mood very quickly with very limited amounts of data. What I've noticed in Britain with the behavioural change unit in government is they are running opinion poll after opinion poll after opinion poll, really just trying to gauge what is the public mood. And that is, that's what they've made public, right? They may well be doing other forms of mood management and ascertaining as well, but I don't know what that is. I'd love to know what that is. And maybe that's something we should actually be trying to research a bit. But my sense is that they're not very used to doing this in Britain, and I imagine in many other countries as well. But they feel compelled to do it because they are in charge now. It is a total government state at the moment in terms of everyone not working, relying on the government for money, and not being able to move around and visit your loved ones. So it's just really interesting, I think, isn't it? How different governments are differently set up for this. And it does make you wonder about what the role of government actually is and should be going forward, if this is the new normal, if, pandemics like COVID-19 keep coming.
I think there's a delicious question about the political economy of managing sentiment. So obviously kind of WeChat, as a company is close to government, whereas many of the kind of social media platforms that we use in Australia and the UK and elsewhere are kind of US-based companies. So the way that kind of governments are able to access fire hose data from Twitter, Instagram, and so on and so forth, there are quite strict limits on those, and those levels of access have changed in recent years. They used to be a lot more open. Social media companies now have a lot more control over them, where I suspect in possibly in relation to WeChat, being able to access the kind of both personal data and sentiment data is a little bit different. So yeah, I think there's a delicious international question to ask there about the political economy of access to sentiment and personal data.
Yeah.
I'm going to come in here again at this point. Look, there are so many fascinating strands to this discussion. We could take another couple of hours really to try and shape them out fully. I myself, as an anthropologist, am sitting here with this idea of a collapse of registers, which you gave us, Andrew, that I would very, very much like to tease out a bit more further across the 3 papers around questions of transformations in selves, transformations in place, in the way we're all now experiencing our homes as these places that have been requisitioned by governments, as a good friend and colleague of mine put it in a recent piece of writing. I think that and indeed in the transformation of government. But I'm aware that we're quite close to time, or the time that we thought we would take for this. So perhaps it's a good moment to bring David back in and ask David if you would like to respond to any of the discussion that has gone on since you spoke right at the beginning of our session.
Thanks, Melinda. Yeah, it's fascinating, and moving from the empathic industrial to the idea of how governments are to describe that even in terms of mood makes me think of the work that those people, and I'm forgotten their name right now. I think Erickson is one of them, that Spotify did, and the Spotify sort of teardown book that came out last year, which is it's interesting that we're moving away from notions of entertainment related to mood. Not to say that it isn't in the political dimension, but that it becomes in our larger mediated, if we can call it that, social mediated, online cultural mediated forms of communication, that we imagine this greater connection and it's important. You can see why governments would absolutely move into those sorts of spaces and try to produce consequences that are good. But I see that my internet connection is unstable, so I don't know if my voice is going through as well as it should. But it's also what a challenge to the organization of polities, and its relationship to other economic models of cultural power. Affective power is something that I explored a lot in my earlier writing. And it migrates between different parts of our cultures, but we often think that it's sectored into certain parts of our culture. I'll stop there and
So rather than just stop there, perhaps I should pose the question: has anyone got anything that they would like to bring to the discussion before we wind up? Any of the speakers, or indeed anyone else who's joined us, feel free to raise your hand.
Yeah, Melinda, originally we were going to have this themed and open discussion, but obviously we've gone longer in each of these dimensions. So I think you're right that just if you have something, say it now. It would be really good. And whatever way you want to do it, just jump in, but also maybe raise your hand so Melinda can see you or something like that as well, if you're curious that way. Also, Luke and Alexia, keep following the chat as it emerges. I see some big ones there, so there might be something else that you two could bring in for a little bit, and then we'll pull it all together and let Andy, Vian, and myself say some last words and call it a day.
I mean, I think from the chat perspective, we've seen, but we'll study it, I think, because we've seen a lot of different national responses to emotional management. And I think clarifying each of those would be, yes, a very interesting project and discussion to bring forward in more detail. So we'll keep tabs on that.
Yeah, and it was one of those things that I posted on there. Can we copy and paste them? Because we're seeing some, others are missing some, they're watching something else. Be wonderful to
Alexia's got that.
Oh, good, well done. And yeah, and I guess that the next stage is one more chance. Anyone can jump in, and oh, we've got a hand raised. Terry's ready to go.
I practiced my little hand thing like I was in class. Do it. You guys, this has been awesome. Just to pull one more little thread, because I think it brings some things together in this discussion of different reads of empathy, machines, humans, and then also different negotiations of risk. One thing that is kind of bubbling for me is the concept of shame and how it operates intrapsychically, intrapersonally, how it operates institutionally, and the way that it kind of moves through all of these different registers. We were having a little side chat in the chat thing about I was talking about the futures market that just happened with oil in the US today, and people losing their shit, and because oil's like negative now, I think. Yeah. But really the only people who stand to lose from that are futures traders. And so there's a whole, for the first time, a clapback of people saying, why do I care that you're losing money in the futures market? And I see a very similar dynamic happening between landlords and tenants, where landlords are saying, but I need that rent money to pay my mortgage, and really not understanding how the labor class versus the landlord class works and what investment means. And so these, and one more thing about risk and reading things, I just saw a whole series of things where there's the stimulus check that's supposed to be coming, right? So you can go on the government site in the US right now and check for that if you have a social security number. So that's supposed to be your mark of identification. But in the US, one of the ways people run credit checks is by asking for your social security number. So more and more landlords are logging into these systems using social security numbers and then contacting their tenants saying, I see that you have money in your system. Where's my check? Missing the identity theft part. So I think this notion of what's mine, what's yours, what do we share? I think it happens at the affective level, at the data level, at the social level, and increasingly these things are kind of coming and mixing together, and often what makes things acceptable or not wind up turning on notions of shame.
Fascinating.
Yeah. The end. I'll put my hand down.
Yeah. I mean, my immediate thought and reaction to that, I think, as for the first time, we are facing these issues as a society. We're facing COVID as a society. And I'm not quite sure all our countries are going to go down the lines of using words like solidarity. But I think there is a sense that we're in this together. So in terms of the connection with shame, I think as we kind of look forward to coming out of this, and we look forward to the next kind of 5, 10, maybe even 20 years, we need to be thinking in kind of terms of a Green New Deal. So I think in terms of the shame, the inertia, and I think those kind of moments of shame that we each have when we're kind of disposing of kind of certain items, how we use certain things, that kind of issue of kind of personal and collective shame, societal shame in relation to what we're doing about the environment. Maybe this kind of sense of affective solidarity that we're feeling at the moment can be leveraged towards a Green New Deal. So I think, yeah, that would be my kind of take on kind of your discussion about shame.
And a kind of global citizenship as well. There's something that needs to be explored much more than we have so far. And I'm not sure whether the work on crypto democracy, even though we've had some discussion about some other Bitcoin relationships to these things, is worth investigating as well. But we have to think about, as much as we're worried about what happens within different cultural environments, we also have to see, globally, what is the transformation that we would like to see across the planet. And maybe this does open up, transnational, transcultural relations, as much as we think it's pulling back from those things as well.
Yeah, I think we need a research project into this, well funded by many nations, to actually investigate these issues, because it is fascinating, and you could envisage something totally transformative. I mean, I personally am pessimistic that that would actually happen. I think as soon as a vaccine is found, we're back to normal. And I will wonder if any of this sense of solidarity and shame, or whatever we're feeling at the moment, will continue and transfer to other issues. It'd be lovely if they could. But I do also, on the other hand, think we have been forced to stop and reflect and think. So maybe, but this should be research, right? I think this requires we should all get together in some big multinational research project immediately. Put a project in.
Let me just come in and push you all a little bit further on this idea of effective solidarity. We've had a very a poignant question put by our colleague William Abbour, asking for advice on how people can cope and manage fear, anxiety and uncertainty. And I think we're all in various ways struggling with these very basic, personal, intimate questions. And as communication scholars and people in the world, it would be wonderful to have any thoughts from any of the three of you on that very particular question.
Well, the advice from British behavioural scientists advising the government is just tune into state media once a day, or just tune into any media once a day. Get your update. Don't dwell on it. Don't keep rereading, and don't let it traumatize you as you get the rolling headline or the rolling social media feed. So that would be one. I mean, they've done the research into it, and they seem to think that that is psychologically helpful. Not to immerse yourself too much, really, I think.
In the Australian context, we went through an interesting pre-time of COVID-19, which was the bushfires. And one of the things that was really clear about that was the and the way that we were finding out things, and the 24-hour coverage that was going, whatever media form you're looking at, whether you were on an app that just would say, when is a fire closer to you or further away from you? It produced a similar level of anxiety, I think, as Australia went through that. And it hasn't ended in a lot of ways. It's just shifted, and now we've shifted to something else. But it was interesting the way that governments kind of actually learned in Australia about what happened there. They mismanaged a fair bit that was building there, not to a level that was incredibly damaging to humans, but at a level of what was permissible as, and the word would be ethics. The ethics of leadership were challenged in the bushfire ones. And ethics is a really interesting word because it means, from the Greek, character. And we know that politicians are presenting variations of themselves all over the place. So whether it's the transformation of Kumo, saying, oh, he's a great guy, which really reminds me of Rudolph Giuliani, who was a great guy, 20 years ago in 9/11 territory. And then he seems so unethical in terms of the way he's behaved since then. And likewise, you'd see other ones rising to a notion of what would be good or bad. So I think it's important to see crises as these cultural transformations that happen at the larger political level, and also are happening at our engagement with politics. It changes quite dramatically. And I can't even imagine what will happen in the American context in terms of an election. I can't get my head around what will be happening in 4 or 5 months related to that particular country. But these are things, that's a start, at least for me. I wonder whether we should, yeah, I'll stop for a second, see what others have to say. Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, I didn't, yeah. So in terms of kind of final thoughts, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, I think so. Let's go to final thoughts, relax, enjoy our evenings, other people's mornings, those sorts of things.
I mean, I've also got the chat window open here. So I think, you know, I don't kind of have anything kind of hugely intellectual to say at the end. But I think in terms of, you know, this kind of issue of kind of teachers managing our own responses, anxiety, you know, hopefully it doesn't sound flippant or banal, but I think as Vianne said, it's about not getting kind of hooked into 24/7 media cycles, really limiting exposure to media. And I think, you know, just being kind, not only to other people, but yourself as well. Give yourself a break in terms of what you could hope to achieve during this period. And, you know, yeah, just be kind to yourself and be kind to others. Apologies if that sounds flippant.
Vianne?
I think that's a beautiful moment to end on. But Vianne, I don't want to stop you from adding to it, please.
No. Well, Andy just stole all my thoughts, so
empathy.
And verbalize them. That's fine.
I want to thank everyone for coming, and the ideas that have happened in the chat room, I suppose, and in other areas have been incredible. There are all sorts of directions for this kind of thinking to be taken by us as scholars, as people who think about these things, that both are involved in it, you know, incredibly connected emotionally to this thing, and also that weird capacity that we have of abstracting ourselves temporarily from it, back and forth. And I think Melinda has captured that idea that we're living in an odd kind of tension. And I hope that we can at least make that tension valuable for the future of our cultures. And if we can do that, that would be wonderful. Even as we deal with death, destruction in all sorts of parts of the world and for all sorts of families and cultures that we can't even anticipate now. But if we just see it as a possibility for what we can give to it, whatever our intellectual expertise, our thoughtful expertise as well, and our interpersonal expertise, you know, let's say that we've had a seminar that has allowed us to move forward that way.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thanks, Andrew and Vianne, for joining us very much and for your terrific thought-provoking talks. Thanks, Alexia and Luke, for marvellous wrangling of discussion. And thanks to all of you who've come along and joined the chat and been a part of this. We really appreciate it. We'll all go away now and think on how we might come together again to pursue some of these discussions a bit further. I think that would be terrific. So we hope you have a great day in Wales, and we'll go off and drink wine and have dinner and those sorts of things. Shame we can't all be going to the pub together, but these are the strange times we're in. I don't know, can you do a collective applause in this?
I don't know what happens when we do that, but we could try it. Let's see what it sounds like. It might sound deafening.
A feedback loop that breaks Zoom.
And keep in mind, we'll try to make these things public. So if you know of someone else who's out there that's moderately interested but wasn't connected to this, we're going to try to at least make this a little bit visible. We've recorded it, as we told you at the start, and we have different presentations that we can actually pass on as well. So we're going to advance on our project that we started, and Andy and Vienna are already doing a series of projects, but the Japan UK one is pretty interesting. We could hear more about that in the future. But thanks again, and thank you all for coming.
Oh.
I'm gonna
Good
call it a
night.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, guys.